Welcome to Homuth Books, where every story goes deeper, darker, doesn't like that. I'm Theodore Homuth, author of The Unexpected. Here, every tale cuts deep. Every world dares you to enter, and every word is exactly where it needs to be. Let's begin.
Johnson never intended to unleash anything that sweltering night. His only desire was to lose himself in the familiar comfort of his guitar, to play as he always had at May's dive house, where the world's edges softened under the haze of cheap liquor and cigarette smoke. The heat that August evening was a living thing, pressing against the warped wooden walls of the bar like damp cotton, heavy and unyielding. Inside, the air hung thick, saturated with the scent of stale beer, sweat, and the faint tang of lemon polish May used on the counter. Outside, the late summer dusk stretched endlessly, the sky bruised purple and gold, the horizon trembling under a breathless stillness that made the world feel poised on the edge of something unspoken. The regulars slumped at their tables, nursing drinks that barely sweated in the oppressive warmth, their conversations a low murmur, like the drone of cicadas beyond the open door. May stood behind the bar, her broad shoulders squared, polishing a glass that gleamed under the dim overhead lights. She moved with the rhythm of habit, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet authority of someone who'd seen every kind of night unfold in her place. It should have been an ordinary evening, indistinguishable from the countless others that had come before. But when Johnson lifted his guitar from its worn case, the strings felt foreign beneath his calloused fingertips, as if they'd been restrung by unfamiliar hands. He settled on the low stool in the corner, his boots scuffing the gritty floorboards, and adjusted the tuning pegs absently, his mind drifting. The guitar had been his father's, its body scratched and faded from decades of late nights in smoky rooms, its sound as warm and deep as a whispered secret. Johnson's fingers began to move before his thoughts could catch up, muscle memory guiding them into a pattern he didn't recognize. The melody that emerged wasn't one he'd learned, not from his father's patient lessons, not from the crackling vinyl records he pored over as a teenager, not even from the street musicians he trailed as a wide-eyed boy, mesmerized by their nimble hands. It came unbidden, raw and aching, a minor key blues that seemed to rise from the marrow of his bones. The notes were slow, deliberate, each one hanging in the air like a drop of ink spreading through water, pulling the room into its undertow. The change was immediate, though subtle at first. Conversations faltered, words trailing off as heads turned toward the stage. Glasses paused mid-sip, condensation pooling untouched on tabletops. Even the air seemed to shift, growing denser, as if the room itself had leaned closer to listen. The melody wove through the space, wrapping around the listeners like a spell, storing something primal, something they couldn't name but felt in their chests. In the far corner of the bar, a figure appeared. Or perhaps he'd been there all along, unnoticed until the music summoned attention to him. He was tall and gaunt, his frame swallowed by a long dark coat that hung unnaturally still, untouched by the faint breeze drifting through the open door. His hat was pulled low, the brim casting his face into shadow, hiding his eyes. His presence was like a stain seeping into the floorboards, oily and pervasive, a weight that pressed against the senses without explanation. He didn't move, didn't speak, just listened, his stillness more unsettling than any gesture could have been. Johnson kept playing, his fingers moving with a will of their own. He didn't understand why. Perhaps he couldn't stop. The song poured through him, urgent and relentless, as if it had waited years, decades for this moment to find a voice, as if it had chosen him, not the other way around. The lights above flickered, a brief stutter that drew a few glances upward. Outside, the wind began to stir, circling the building with a low, restless moan that seemed to echo the melody. May was the first to sense the shift. Her hands froze mid-wipe, the rag still pressed against the glass, her jaw tightening in a way that suggested she'd remembered something long buried, something no one else in the room could know. Her eyes flicked toward Johnson, then to the stranger in the corner, and back again. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The room felt it, the weight of something arriving, uninvited but inevitable. By the time the final note fell, the stranger had vanished as silently as he'd appeared. The crowd's usual hum didn't return. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive, like the town had drawn a deep breath and forgotten how to release it. The nightmares began that night, creeping into Johnson's sleep like thieves. He dreamed of the melody, but it was no longer his. It came warped and distant, carried on a wind that howled his name with a familiarity that chilled him. The notes twisted, sharp and discordant, like a blade scraping bone. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart hammering, the room too small to contain the dread that clung to him. When he picked up his guitar the next evening, even the familiar songs betrayed him. The chords he'd played 1,000 times shifted under his fingers, bending just enough to make him flinch, as if the instrument itself had turned against him. He tried to shake it off, told himself it was the heat, the whiskey, the late hour. But the unease grew roots, sinking deeper with each passing day. He started drinking heavier, the burn of bourbon a fleeting shield against the melody that haunted him. At first, it was just to sleep, to quiet the dreams that waited on the edge of consciousness. Then it was to forget the song, the stranger, the way the room had felt that night. Eventually, it was simply to not feel, to numb the creeping certainty that something had changed irrevocably. Grandma Ray watched it all unfold with the quiet strength that had carried her through a lifetime of hard years. She'd raised Johnson after his mother left, her hands steady and her voice firm, teaching him the old ways, how to listen to the land, how to respect what couldn't be seen. Now she sat in her rocking chair on the porch, her eyes tracking him as he stumbled home at dawn, reeking of liquor and regret. She didn't scold, didn't plead. She just watched, her silence heavier than any words. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she called him to her. He sat on the porch steps, his head bowed, the guitar case leaning against the railing like an accusation. "You opened a door, child," she said, her voice low and steady, her hands folded over her lap like an old spell woven tight. "And now you're drinking to drown what came through?" Johnson laughed, a bitter sound that cracked in his throat. "Ain't no doors, Grandma. Just a song, just me messing up like always." But her eyes held his, unyielding, and deep down, he knew she was right. The music had turned on him, become something alive, something hungry, and whatever had slipped through that night at Mays wasn't finished with him. Luther was born not long after, a soft, wide-eyed boy with a shock of dark hair and fingers that wrapped around Johnson's pinky like a vow. For a fleeting moment, Johnson believed the boy might save him. Fatherhood felt like a lifeline, a chance to close the door he'd unwittingly opened. He held Luther close, humming old lullabies, the guitar forgotten in its case. The nightmares receded, if only slightly, and the melody's grip loosened. But the music never truly let go. It called to him in quiet moments, a whisper beneath the everyday sounds of life, the clink of dishes, Luther's soft coos, the creak of the floorboards. And the bottle, always within reach, offered more silence than fatherhood ever could. It dulled the fear, the guilt, the sense that something was still listening. Johnson raised Luther as best he could, which was never enough. The anger came too easily, sparked by small things, a spilled glass, a sleepless night, the weight of his own failures. His voice would rise, sharp and cutting, and Luther would shrink away, his eyes wide but dry. The guilt followed like a shadow, heavier each time. Mornings were quiet with shame. Johnson unable to meet his son's gaze over breakfast, the air thick with unspoken apologies. Luther never cried loud. Even as a toddler, he watched his father with a stillness that unnerved Johnson, as if the boy understood something about him that even Johnson couldn't grasp. That understanding, that quiet forgiveness, only deepened the guilt, embedding it in Johnson's bones. 12 years passed before Johnson's liver surrendered, worn out by years of bourbon and regret. In his final days, he lay in a hospital bed, a shrunken figure, his skin yellowed and thin as parchment, his breath shallow and ragged. He looked far older than his years, a ghost still tethered to a failing body. The room smelled of antiseptic and decay, the hum of machines a cruel counterpoint to the silence between him and his son. Luther stood by the bedside, his shoulders broader now, his frame carrying the weight of years too heavy for a boy of 12. He didn't speak at first, just stood, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes fixed on his father's frail form. Johnson's voice was barely a breath, each word a struggle. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his chest rising unevenly. "Ain't got much left in me, but—" His fingers twitched, reaching for Luther's hand, trembling with the effort. Luther leaned closer, his face unreadable, and Johnson's eyes rolled upward, glassy and wide with sudden urgency. "Don't play that song, boy," he murmured, his voice cracking. It listens back. Then he was gone, the machines falling silent, the room emptier than it had ever been. May didn't speak of the song again for years, though her eyes carried the memory of that night, a shadow that never quite lifted. She kept the bar running, her hands as steady as ever, but there was a caution in her now, a wariness that hadn't been there before. Grandma Ray took Luther in, tucking him into her small house with the same fierce love she'd given Johnson. She cooked for him, mended his clothes, taught him the old stories, but she spoke little of his father. One night, as she sat with Luther on the porch, the stars sharp above them, she said only, "Your daddy was a good man once." Before the music turned, Luther nodded, his young face solemn, and didn't ask for more. But somewhere deep in the bones of the town, beneath the creaking floorboards of May's dive house, beneath the hum of crickets and the restless sigh of the wind, something had heard the song that night, and it had never stopped listening.
Thanks for watching or listening to Homuth Books. If this story left a mark, be sure to like or subscribe. New stories are often, so please follow me at Homuth Books, or simply visit homuthbooks.com for more fiction, updates, and behind-the-scenes content. Until next time, stay real, stay hungry, and let's keep the story going.